abilities. I'm going to see if I can make sure that doesn't happen.
Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to our third session today on this mini conference, Emergency Remote Teaching and Learning. Zaretta Hammond is here. Zaretta, how's that internet connection?
I think we're good. We'll keep the prayers going for connectivity.
Nice. So if you would like to share your screen, you can start now.
Fantastic. Well, welcome everybody, and I'm really excited to be here with you. And I think the topic of, how do we do remote learning and teaching differently is really, really important, because we want students to be able to kind of continue their learning. So that's really what I want to be able to talk about in the time that we have together. We've got about 45 minutes. I'm going to share some big ideas with you, and then we'll make time for questions. So if you can kind of hold those questions to closer to the end of our time, then I can make sure that I see them all, and we can get to them. So what I want to be able to do is share with you a bit of what I talk about when I am talking about kind of instructional equity, keeping equity at the center of teaching learning. And the question now is, how do we do that when everything is remote? And so being able to actually think about this is what I've been doing for a long time. Not the remote part, but the equity part. So I am the author of Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. I am a former classroom teacher. I taught writing when I was in the classroom, and it was these techniques that I developed to get my students to accelerate their writing development and their reading comprehension. I did use that as a coach and professional developer and consultant over the last 20 plus years. And a teacher challenged me a few years ago to actually sit down and write down this methodology. And that's how culturally responsive teaching in the brain came to be. And what I did was really fostering and looking at how to blend neuroscience and what we understand about culturally responsive practice. And so that's what we are going to talk a little bit about today. How do we make sure that our kids are getting what they need during this time? Because we know there have been some equity issues exposed, right? Technology access, challenges with communication in terms of parents and teachers, and how are we going to do this, even within the school system. Lack of support for students who are further behind, be they special education students or students who were struggling before we went to remote learning. And that's where a lot of the conversation has been. And what I want to remind us of is that there are some other issues that we need to think about. We need to think about those in relationship to what Steve Covey says. What are the things that we can influence or we have control over? And I think the biggest thing we have control over, what's in our circle of influence, is reducing learning loss. Because to me, that is the top equity issue. We're going to figure out technology. A lot of schools, a lot of educators, and school systems are doing the best they can there. But that's a larger social issue that once we come back to whatever our new normal is, we're going to figure that piece out. But right now, what I want us to be able to do is to think about, even in this climate with remote learning and teaching, how do we minimize learning loss? Because if we don't, we're going to actually grow our achievement gaps, because learning gaps turn into opportunity gaps, turn into achievement gaps. So this is kind of to me, the equity issue we want to keep front and center. Now, as I said before, I started to blend culturally responsive teaching practices with neuroscience and started to see students really be able to accelerate their learning. What I want to do before I jump into some of the how-tos is really talk about what does it mean to culturally responsive. If you actually
Hey,
listen
Zaretta,
to the way, yeah.
it's Steve. Your audio's breaking up just a little. We can still understand you, but maybe turn your video off and it will give more bandwidth to your audio.
That's a great idea. Okay, let's hold. I'm going to just do this really quickly so I can turn that off. Let's see. Not having that success there yet.
If you look at the top of your screen, you should see a little green
There we
strip.
go. Thank you. All right. Is that better? Let's see.
I'd say keep going and I'll let you know if it's not.
All right. Fantastic. All right. So this is the technology gremlins at work. So what I was saying is really being able to have some shared language around what does it mean to be culturally responsive. And that's an important thing. If you actually look at the internet and the way people are talking about culturally responsive teaching in school districts, then what happens is we have a tendency to think it's just about relationships. You know, the teacher who's doing the cool handshakes in the hallway. But the reality is there's so much more to it. And so I want to take just a minute to make sure we have shared language, because the way people talk about it, as I just said, is can be very challenging, very problematic. And so, see, can you still hear me, Steve?
Yes, and it is better.
Okay, fantastic. Just checking before I go any further. So shared language matters. Culturally responsive teaching isn't about hip hop or classroom management, low self-esteem. It really is about how do we help students become more powerful learners. And so being able to actually distinguish between these three things is really an important piece before we talk about how do we leverage culturally responsive teaching in remote learning. Because if we think it's only multiculturalism or building relationships, then we are going to be limited in how we apply it, or we're going to think, well, we're not physically with our students, so we can't build that relationship. But let me distinguish between these three. So culturally responsive teaching is at one end. Multicultural education is something different. We can start there. That is where diversity and inclusion efforts live. It's really about social harmony, celebrating diversity. Then you have social justice education, focuses on exposing the social political context, right? We have implicit bias training and anti-racist efforts are there. That's that critical consciousness we want both teachers and students to have. But the thing that is really important to remember about those first two is that neither one of those are related to improving cognition. And that's where culturally responsive teaching comes in, particularly the way that scholars like Dr. Hilliard, Dr. Latham Billings, Geneva Gay, a lot of folks who decades ago were talking about this, really started to focus on independent learning, the ability for students to be cognitively independent, not compliant, like follow directions independent, but really be able to grow their brain power. This is where efforts to actually accelerate live. So it's a really important distinction, because when we come to this set of culturally responsive design principles for instruction, I think understanding that it's really around trying to help students leverage the funds of knowledge that they have and their cognition, that becomes a critical piece. So as we go through this, I want to share these three principles that are rooted in collectivist learning principles, right? And the first is anchor with a big picture question to set the stage for making connections to other things. So in collectivist learning, right, the idea is collectivism is a cultural orientation that wires our brain from 0 to 7. And it's not just about, oh, those kids like to work in groups, so I can't be culturally responsive. Actually, there are a set of learning principles that are rooted in collectivist cultural orientation. And one is things go from whole to part. So what's the big picture? What's the overview? And then being able to see how these things are knitted together. The second is build on funds of knowledge by contextualizing for stickiness, using cognitive hooks and background knowledge. That's one of the things we're going to talk about. And then leveraging chewing. How do you help students by making, doing, and designing so that learning actually gets sticky? All right. So I see there's a raised hand. I'm going to keep going. Maybe Steve, you can let me know if there's something I need to attend to there.
I will. I'll check on it.
All right. Thanks a lot. So the thing that we're going to apply those skinny set of design principles to is this idea of the learning pit. This is James Nottingham's analogy of cognition, and I really use it to help people understand how culturally responsive practices work. So learning this way, we start there. Everybody learns, but at some point we level up. Learning gets hard, we get stretched, and we have to get into the pit of learning in order for our brains to grow. This is what Vygotsky calls the zone of proximal development. And so this getting down into the pit is where relational piece becomes really critical. So being able to help students manage their emotions, manage self-talk, this is the SEL part of culturally responsive teaching. But the piece that people don't talk about is engaging students in productive struggle so that they take things apart and put it back together. So one of the core design principles of collectivist learning practice is this learning by doing, learning by taking things apart, observing them closely, putting them back together. Design thinking talks about this in terms of the prototyping and iterating. So we have to give students an opportunity to do this kind of stuff when they're learning, and doing remote learning is going to be a great opportunity for this. So that as they are doing that, they are processing information, and this is what brings them up out of the pit. And they start to make connections. Oh, I see that how that's connected to this. Oh, that's an example or a non-example. So really understanding that culturally responsive practice has two parts. It has a relational part, you're doing that, but it also has an instructional part that becomes really, really critical to pay attention. And that's a piece I want us to pay attention to in the time we have together today. So here's a great quote that I love because it reiterates that information processing is the core of getting students to reduce that learning loss and to increase their cognition. Processing that doesn't proceed to the elaboration stage fails to make the connections that build understanding. So we keep talking about, we want students to kind of build their understanding and be able to do critical thinking, but if they are not able to actually do a couple of things that we're going to talk about in a minute, then we know that processing is not going to proceed to the stage where they can grapple with and engage in productive struggle. So what I want to offer here are the learning practices that are going to reduce this learning loss. And in the time we have, I think I can talk about two, and then we'll have a little time for some questions. So the first one to talk about is deepening background knowledge and strengthening literacy and building word wealth. And here's what I want to suggest. There's a way in which we talk about parents as, particularly if we're talking about students of color or historically marginalized students not being able to support their kids. I would say we need to rethink how we talk about parents because they are always the student's first teacher. So whatever we're doing during remote learning, we're in some ways handing it off to the parent, not to be a substitute teacher. They can't be you. But what they can do is be that first teacher again and help create the environment for students to engage in background knowledge development and strengthening literacy, even if it's in their mother tongue, right? That whole idea is we want the brain to keep working. This is not about new content. This is about helping students actually consolidate, meaning go deeper with, make permanent in their brains information they already have. This is a great time to encourage students to start doing that braiding together and building that background knowledge. So let's just start with the literacy piece. So I think building word wealth is one of the best things you can do. Helping, whether it's young children, I'm going to talk about young children, and then kind of talking about, what do we do for older children? So the road to reading, we want kids to love reading. So I'm on the internet and I see everybody reading a book to kids, and I'm like, that's all wonderful. But if the children can't read independently, then when we come back together in school, they're going to get further behind. This is an opportunity for them to strengthen the skills of reading. This is a graphic, and I love this graphic because if you actually see the starting point is down here, they have to become automatic in their ability to decode, and then that's going to lead to comprehension. So at the top, just for fun, we hear folks, so we want kids to love reading, but competence precedes confidence. So we want them to start building the competence, but we want to do it in a fun and engaging way. So for young children, they need to be doing more puzzles and mazes. This is something parents can do. This is something we can assign. And the idea is puzzles and mazes help wire the brain for reading. So we don't learn to read by reading a book. That's the practice of how we know letters and sounds. And so reading is just decoding, taking that stuff off the page. But we got to get the young brains ready. So puzzles, if you just Google mazes for preschoolers, you can print these out. The eye, hand, mouth coordination is really a key piece. Parents can do this easily. You can do this in a remote way. You can do it together. It feels fun. That learning by doing is rooted in that collectivist practice, making it more responsive. Again, books we want to read to young children, but that's really about print awareness, right? That reading goes from left to right, that the things on the page have some meaning, and, the squiggly lines. We're not trying to teach letters and sounds. Parents don't necessarily have to do that. What they just need to help students with is word play and word consciousness and what we call word wealth. So as we start to talk about children in upper grades, like third grade, fourth grade, we are able to actually talk about that. So here's the word. I want you to the word walk. I want you to think of other words that come to mind when you think of the word walk. I'll give you a second. Stroll, strut, sachet is my favorite. Type some in the chat. I'm going to read them right now because we have a limited amount of time. So I want to make sure I get to that. So here's the idea. Kids need word wealth. So the degree to which we are helping them over time get more words, not just collect them, vocabulary lists, but literally know them and use them. And we can make this fun. Have robust word study tasks that you give families, right? Encourage that word play. This is not about a worksheet. This is about looking around your home, looking around your community, when you go on a walk, being curious about words you hear, as well as curious about words you see. So there are things that you can do that actually get us in that learning by doing, right? Making mode of collectivist cultural practice. Encourage word games. This is not necessarily Scrabble, but something like Taboo, right? And being able to play heads up. And the degree to which there's a great game called Boggle. These are all things that parents can engage in and do in a way that just builds that word wealth without it being a lesson and I've got to now teach my child, sit down with my child how to read. We just want to encourage that consciousness so students don't have that learning loss. The other thing I want to encourage us to do during remote teaching and learning is assign word collecting. I love this little book by Peter Reynolds called The Word Collector. And that's exactly what the book is about. It's a great book to read with young kids, but it's also a great thing to do. He goes around and collects words that are interesting to him, make him curious, make him happy. Then he starts to pair them together. So things you can do. right? Give scavenger hunts or challenges, do contrastive analysis, right? Standard use versus everyday use, connotation, denotation. How has a word evolved, right? Words for cool, right? What is the 40s and 50s and 60s? Just as a generational activity, that could be a really interesting thing. How did you guys do blah, blah back in the day? So this, again, is that community thing going within the family, or kids can, reach out to other friends and family members. So there are just lots of fun ways to go about word collecting that are not an assignment on a worksheet, right? It's not a vocabulary list. Magnetic poetry, we want to hand things out, we can hand some magnetic poetry out, right? And have parents and kids on that refrigerator or on whatever, right? You can take a pan out of the cupboard and use it for magnetic poetry. So we can be innovative in how we assign these. So lots of ideas there about how to just in our natural environment encourage that part of literacy development in a way that doesn't look schoolish. We're not trying to replicate school at home. What we're trying to replicate is natural learning, so that kids understand learning is not just what happens in school, it is what happens in life. And this is a great opportunity to reinforce that. In the time that I have left, I want to talk about building background knowledge as the second thing that I think is most powerful that we can do. So when we talk about this being a culturally responsive practice, it's culturally responsive not because it talks about issues of race or social justice. That's a misconception about what culturally responsive is, or that it has to talk about students' cultural identities. It's about building that schema that they have. And so I want us to try a little thought experiment to better understand this idea of schema. So I'm going to show you a passage. You can read along, I'll read it, and then I want you to tell me what you think is happening. What is this passage about? The procedure is actually simple. First, you arrange things into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do too few at once than too many. All right, what do you think that's about? So I want you to think for a minute, pop something in the chat. And like I said, I'm going to take a really quick look. Let's see. Yes, you guys are so smart. So some people are quick on the draw, and yes, it is about laundry. And here's the reason we know it's about laundry, is we have schema for that. Trust me. I've done this before, and people have a variety of things that are not laundry. And it's all good, because the more you know, the more this background knowledge, what we call schema you have, the more your comprehension goes up. Meaning I don't have to know about inert, information or factoids. The more I understand how things work, these just kind of run in the back of our brain. So the equity connection I want to make is, to do more cognitive work, you have to have deep background knowledge. So having deep background knowledge, schema, not just knowing more stuff, but how things are connected, helps reduce that learning loss. You can't give a student background, so you can't assign background knowledge. All you can do is create opportunities for students to start making connections, that knowledge tree in their head, because all knowledge, all schema is organized in a way that is culturally grounded. You don't have to try to control the culture part. All you're asking students to do is actually start to make connections so that it moves into their background knowledge. This is what turns inert information into usable knowledge over time, is that idea of building background knowledge and building schemas. So I think it's one of the smallest but high leverage things we can do during remote learning to encourage students to continue to grow. So how do we do that? Here are a couple of really quick things. Assign more nonfiction books. Assign books about stuff, not stories. So we have a tendency to over-rely on stories. You can build on student interest. You guys can create, if you're using Google Classroom, hey, what are the books we're interested in? You can have students do open technology, meaning they self-select into groups where they want to learn about stuff based on their interests. So you survey them. What are they into? You know, what are those interests? Start with community curiosities. Tell them to go out in their community and start to, you know, learn more about kind of the various structures, the various things that are happening in their communities. It could be historical buildings, or it could be what are the, what are the trees, types of trees in your area. Connect it to the units, connect it to the standards, but still make it open-ended enough where students actually can do that. You know, a walkabout, landmarks, interesting elements of people. Who are the people in the community? This is in keeping with the Common Core shifts, whether your state is practicing Common Core or not, whether you're internationally, if there are other standards that we're trying to maintain during remote learning. But the reality is human beings have been learning a lot, and encourage families to continue to build that background knowledge. Interesting facts they can share, right? Go find an interesting fact. Here's the thing, if they are watching television, a lot of students are, and they're watching a lot of that on their computer, whether it's YouTube or other places, assign informational programs, right? Create a kind of Netflix of documentaries or nature shows or historical events that students then can lead with their interest, and then let that bring them down a rabbit hole of more schema. Allow that choice, right? And you want to allow that choice within the parameters of what standards you're trying to teach, right? This is the same for math. And a lot of times we think, oh, that's just about English or history or social studies. No, we can do the same for math and science, right? Remember Miss Frizzle? This was chock full of science, right? Where's the science naturally happening? So same goes for math. You can help students see that these things are all around them. It's a wonderful time for that. But here's the way we make this powerful. It's just not by assigning things to read or watching the show. Is that you have to give the brain a directive. It won't stick if you don't tell it what to do. So you can create a simple inquiry sheet. So questions like, as you're watching, you know, whatever you choose to watch, what was your biggest surprise from this show or this book, whatever it is they're taking in? And then you can use a thinking routine. This is from Ron Rickhart's work, and he talks about this routine. I used to think, but now I think, right? That is a simple way for students to start to process that information. I used to think, but now I think. Require them to share this information. You could do a podcast style. You can have students, you know, share in a small group. There are a variety of ways to do this. The more we think about and talk about and share information, the stickier it gets in our brain, meaning our background knowledge deepens and it gets stickier. So the next time we're learning, we learn new things faster because of this background knowledge. So it's a great time to have students do that. And again, I go back to the quote, processing that doesn't proceed to the elaboration stage fails to make the connections that build understanding. So we don't want students to just take in inert factoids. This is not about just more stuff, pouring, you know, dates and figures and events in their head, but helping them make meaning of it. Right? Connecting the dots, braiding them together, however we want to talk about that. So that means you want to ask students to actively process, not just take notes. One of the things you could do, this is an example of folks that have been at my workshops, and I look down and they're doing something and I'm like, what are you guys doing? And they'll flash me this. So the one is someone was doing on an iPad where they were in a workshop and they were taking their notes and making meaning. The other, someone was doing sketch noting at a coach training I was doing. And I love both of these examples, and I got their permission to share them. So I think this is a similar process we can help students use. Sketchnoting or doodling for processing of information, for making the connections so that background knowledge is sticky. Thinking routines, right? I used to think, but now I think. But there are other thinking routines as well out there that I would strongly encourage you to look at through Project Zero out of Harvard. Keep it non-graded, introduce it to them, scaffold, then release so they can practice. So this is not just give it to them and like, good luck with that, but you want to kind of show them how to do it together as a group, as a class, in terms of this processing. Practice your doodling, the sketchnoting. It's not to be graded, it's just for their processing. It's key to ask students to connect the unknown to the known, or across concepts, right? What does this remind you of? What are the other things that have these elements in them? Venn diagram-like. So there are a lot of ways that feel playful enough, but they are meaningful in the way in which they are asking kids to actually process that information, so background knowledge deepens. And you want to help them internalize these prompts so that these ways of looking and processing become more permanent. All right, so I am going to pause there, take a breath. We've got some time together. And I want to see where we are in terms of questions. This is good enough time as any to take the question. Let's see.
So you want to click on that Q&A icon. Are you seeing it?
I am, and I'm trying to do the little timestamp. So we're going to start right from the top, and I'm going to answer this live. How do we work to resolve our learning loss when working with students in other countries whose technology needs are not necessarily supported by a westernized school? And this is exactly what I'm talking about, is the idea that you want to be able to think about what does natural learning look like. So we need to, appreciate technology, but we need to know that kids are learning all the time. How do we help them leverage their natural learning environment? No matter what that learning environment is. We don't want to judge it in terms of, class standards or whatever. So let's remove technology from that for a moment as one of the givens, and to say, what are the things? Is it them going back to old school style games? Is it, again, collecting things or making things in their environment? The maker education, I think, is really critical for thinking about this. So the idea isn't, and one of the things I've talked about during this is about not relying on technology. Looking at what students have, and then understanding the design principles and saying, how can we help them do these things, right? Word wealth, deepen and strengthen their literacy, as well as deepen their background knowledge. So I think we just have to kind of look at, we have to first take the technology out of the equation. Would it be possible to get a copy of your slide deck? I'll talk to Steve about how we do that.
If you're willing to share your slides, just send them to me and I'll post them with the recording.
All right, that sounds good. How can we adapt to adult learners? This is a really great thing. And here's the thing, the more we know about how the brain learns, the more we are able to do just that, right? The more we are able to understand the design principles of how brains make connections and strengthen their background knowledge. So schema, even with adult learners, and this is where choice comes in. And it's choice within parameters, because if it's too open-ended, students who are still a bit dependent in their learning, even if they're adults, because learning is a trajectory, not an age band, right? You still could be learning something new at 50 and be a novice. be a beginner. So there is a stage of how you move from beginner to the next level, right? This is the idea of how do we get good at taking up a new musical instrument or a new practice. So what you want to do is think about how are you helping adults do natural learning, but particularly with adult learners, how do you help them do hard things? One of the things that we do and when we're learning is we have a tendency when it gets really hard and we have some negative self-talk is we give up. So the thing that we should actually be able to do is help them leverage dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is one of our neurotransmitters. It's one of the yummiest, stickiest things that the brain likes to feast on. Now, what's interesting about dopamine is it is only released when we have a burst of accomplishment that comes from doing something hard. So what you want to be able to do is help them recognize they did something challenging and connect that to some celebration. That's when the brain wires those two together, and that dopamine signature will encourage that learner to want to do it again. So adult learners really need to find the dopamine. So as the teacher of adult learners, you got to figure out where you're going to help them get that dopamine hit. I could go on about that, but I'm not. I'm going to move on. That's a great question. Let's see. I keep moving down here. What have you seen that keeps families and parents from engaging in these activities without prompts from outside schools, teachers? Do you think parents don't realize the impact or feel silly? I think those two things are true. One thing that's true is, the first thing that is true is we underestimate the fact that parents has an impact. They are the child's first teacher, so we need to stop underestimating parents, and we need to encourage and reinforce and partner with parents like that around learning from their skills. They may not know the word pedagogy, but body trait of human, you know pedagogy. So the fact is parents know more. It doesn't have to look like school. That's the thing we have to let go of, right? And then we have to partner with them before there's a crisis. The problem we have right now is now we're trying to do this in a crisis. Well, if you had a relationship with parents before, you know, you're not going to have leverage with them. So let's not try to change parents. Let's try to leverage what parents have available. Sometimes actually being mindful, they're juggling a lot now, rather than just, you know, they don't realize the impact. They realize the impact. Any parent who's best ready to go to school, whether that's through Zoom or that's in a building, understands that, particularly if you're a poor person, particularly if you come from a marginalized community. Education has always been a path out. Let's not underestimate parents in terms of what they understand. They may know all the tools, but we should encourage them that they know more than they know. All right. When doing remote teaching, how can we assist students whose primary language is not English? Keep up. This is why I'm telling you that background knowledge does not depend on having English fluency. What you know is what you know. It's not language bound. So even in their native tongue, that mother tongue, you can still be building background knowledge. This is really key. Now may not be the time to try and extend their English development, their English skills. But word wealth, you could do that. You could do contrastive analysis in English and have kids play with that in playful ways. So we need to lower the bar in the sense that they're going to actually accelerate, but we should up the bar in terms of they should be collecting words, they should be engaging in literate practices, they should, and all of those don't have to be English. Next question. When we, let's see, here we go. As we work with older students, high school, community college, how can we support social emotional needs of our marginalized students when teaching remotely at home? I think the main way we do that with anyone above the 10th grade, right? late high school, 11th, 12th, because these are adults. And so they have to manage their mindset. I think helping students actually do some work around mindset. And this is the idea of the progress principle. So helping them actually say, what do you want to get better at in these next 90 days, 30 days? They help them, again, get the dopamine going. So being able to help them work on their self-talk, resilience, these are really important parts of the social emotional needs. Not just kind of, I need to baby you, or there's a part of us that, you know, our self-talk help students do that. And there are some techniques out there that help students. And I would say, yeah, I'll leave it at that, because otherwise I'll go down a rabbit hole, because this is a really juicy question when we get to college, because students have a lot of self-judgment there. All right, let's get to the next question. And we've got about 15 more minutes before I want to start to wrap up. As we work with, okay, we just did that one, let me get done. What is the Harvard resource again for thinking routines? Okay, oh, that's a great one. So it's called Project Zero. And it is, you can just put in thinking routines. Ron Rickard, Making Thinking Visible is his book, but it's a part of a larger constellation of work they do that really is about helping students build internal cognitive routines. Really powerful work. The idea of those routines are, we want students to use them. So it's not a strategy for teachers. It's a tool to hand off to students. So you have to first help them, introduce it to them, help scout the use of it so they get it correct, and then release them to use it routinely, right? But that is Project Zero. I love their work. All right, let's see here. How do multilingual learners fit in here? The reality is, if you have a second, third, or fourth language, you have a superpower. But the things I'm sharing with you on this webinar still hold true. You still have to build background knowledge. You still have to build word wealth. Those, regardless of what language you speak, that is just maximizing your brain power. So I want to be able to encourage, you know, multilingual learners to do more contrastive analysis. It's going to start with some cross-wiring, cross-training, and, you know, fitness. All right, let's see here. Will this replay be available? I'd like to watch it again. All this, I think they are going to make it available. What does this look like in middle school? Do we have another hour? Because middle school is the intersection of students' self-identity, development, their judgment of themselves. This is the dojo, middle school, really helping them be confident, empowered learners. So understanding how cognition happens. I would really encourage you to read Kathleen Cushman's Fires in the Mind, where she talks about how do we help kids get good at things, not through assessment, but literally have them figure out how to practice. One of the things middle schoolers think is, I have to do it perfectly from the start. But if we help them understand, I call it the theory of the first pancake. Nobody's upset when the first pancake is cooked, right? Even if it's burnt and crunchy on one side and beige and gooey on the other. Nobody says, oh, shut the kitchen down. No pancakes today. No, what you do is the cook makes adjustments and everybody's waiting patiently, right? The first pancake is just information. We have to help middle schoolers really see errors as information. And the more we can do that, the more they're willing to engage in kind of inquiry and exploration and prototyping and iterating. That is the middle school experience. Middle school should be the dojo for that. Let's see here. what are the cultural equity and privacy concerns about asking them to do walkabouts and use their own home and neighborhoods when not everyone in the same home in the same neighborhood? So the idea isn't you're asking them to bring that information back. You're actually asking them to process it. So this, Paul, goes to your point about what do we ask them to do with that information. So we think constantly as educators, we need them to bring it back. You need to tell me about, no, you don't. You start asking them to go and think about this. And they edit, they back. Did you think interesting? So the walkabout is you're out in your community. So the privacy issue is not one that you have to bring things back. So just recognizing that this is helping them just to process it versus I've got to go public with it. All right, let's see. We've got a few more minutes, a few more questions. As a literacy specialist, I have found that Merriam-Webster's discussion about brain in her book, Pouch and Squid, helped me deepen. I love that book. My understanding about each child's experience. I don't have time to really go into the discussion a lot, but I think both of those are worth reading. I mean, her book, House and the Squid, are definitely worth reading. It is on my shelf, and I go back to it routinely. I think it should be kind of required reading. All right, let's see. Cultural learning only meant to be used with marginalized communities. No, it is not. Listen, all instruction is responsive. The question is to whose culture is it responding, right? And part of what we're trying to do is we need to balance cultural orientation, ways of doing things. That's all it means. So this is not a treatment for marginalized students. They're not broken. The system is broken. If we've had any type of colonization, apartheid, segregation, Jim Crow, then you have a system that has marginalized whole of children, undereducate their cognition. So what we're trying to do with culturally responsive teaching is bring back some of those other cultural ways, those that are natural to those communities that have gotten kind of elbowed out of mainstream education. So this is for everybody, because this is about growing brains and what makes information sticky. All right, I am going to take one more question because they just keep on coming. How do we help kids who are 2 grade levels behind and are absent often? How do we get them to come to school? Pam, this is a great question. I don't think it's just a matter of parent buy-in. I think kids vote with their feet. If school feels like it's a place that is not affirming them, it's not helping level up their skills, then they're not going to come. So any student, particularly the older the student gets and realizes how far they're behind, they realize that whatever that setting is, it's not helping them. We don't go back to restaurants where the food is bad and we're underserved. We don't take our dry cleaning to places where we get it back wrinkled and stained and, not cleaned. We say that is not helping me. So if the student recognizes he's 2 grade levels behind and you're not helping him accelerate, he's going to stop coming. Parents aren't going to go to that. So read Karen Mapp's work around parent partnership. This is not parents buying in. This is about you doing something different for parents. That's a whole different reframe in terms of this. This is not about, well, we need to get parents on the train. Parents are voting. It's just they're not liking what you're selling. All right. I am going to stop there. Okay, the sound is going in and out. I'm so sorry. And I hope the recording catches most of this. I'm going to pause right there. I'm going to stop sharing. And so you'll get my lovely face back, hopefully, with my, there it is. Yes. All right. So hopefully we caught the sound. I know it was going in and out a little bit, but we have, I'm just going to read the chat a little bit. Yeah, okay, you guys have gotten a lot going on. Steve, are there any questions you'd like to ask me?
No, the sound was going in and out, but it was never completely unintelligible. I think it was just the internet connection.
All right. Well, I'm sorry about that, but I'm glad we didn't totally lose each other. And in the few minutes that I have, and I know we're a little early, so we certainly can, do a few more questions, or we can, end early. It's your pleasure. You just let me know how we can proceed. But I wanted to make sure that we were able to kind of get through some of the main things. Here's the idea I do want to leave folks with is we do want to help students use this time to regain that natural learning. So this is not about, right, we have to get through this unit. It's that there are skills that we can help them consolidate during this time, get better at, the learning how to learn skills. I think that is really going to be the highest leverage thing we can do during remote learning.
Yeah, a lot of nice comments here. The Fires in the Mind was by whom?
That's by Kathleen Cushman. And she has a few others. That one is really about how kids recognize they get good through practice. And a lot of her work is targeted toward middle school and high school students. She has another one on high schoolers called Becoming and Belonging. Again, social emotional development in high school and how to do that in authentic ways. So she looks at schools that have high levels of newcomers, immigrant students, diverse urban areas. So how are you doing it in ways that help students, continue with their identity development, be that, racial identity development, cultural identity development, but just and she comes up with this really wonderful 6 elements to look for, and you can use that as the lens as we're going forward. And I think there are ways that we build social emotional learning and development across remote learning, so we can continue to build relationships. I think this is a thing that people really do forget, and that is that ritual, right? Find a poem or something and together read that poem, right? Creating a class creed or manifesto about resilience, or all of these are anchoring, and they build relationships without asking students to, violate privacy or things being uneven. Some kids are able to do really, we went to, and other kids like, I can't do that. So you have to think about that. But the idea of coming together around powerful thoughts and words of poets or songs that move us, right? I call this a power song playlist. What are the things that uplift us? What are the songs that give us joy? These are the things that can continue to build that relationship and that sense of connection across distance. All right.
So lots of happy webinar attendees.
Yes. Fantastic. Well, I am going to just look at really quickly what any of these other questions are. Oh, I love this one. It says, what advice can you lend that will help teachers advocate to their district admins about getting the time to work on crafting these strategies? Here's the thing I want to, this is a great question, and it has to do with making the connection to equity and learning loss. No school district wants to say, when we come back from this, that our achievement gaps are going to be bigger. So rather than leaning in on some other argument, the argument of that's their pain point. We don't want an achievement gap. We certainly don't want it bigger. So being able to advocate that we need to be able to reimagine, and we need time for that reimagining. This is design thinking. We need time to do that thinking. Remember the line from the movie Apollo 13 with Tom Hanks back in the day. You know, that's the famous "Houston, we've got a problem" line came up, and the guy that was on the ground, the primary engineer, said, "Oh, we've got to solve this problem." And the newer engineers were saying, "We could do this and we could do that." And he says, "No, we got to go get the box." And then what's the box? And the box was, these are the things that they have up there. We cannot solve their problem with things that they don't have to use. So the engineers were only able to use what was in that box. So teachers need time to think about what students have access to. This is where knowing your students, being in partnership with your parents, is really going to be telling. Either you've been building that relationship and that partnership, and now you can stand on it, or you haven't. So it's just another piece that really take note of. You know, telling your district folks that this is about not letting our achievement gap get exacerbated, but also recognizing we now see where the weak spots are in our relationship and partnership with parents. I think it's a really, really critical piece. All right, I'm going to stop there. We could go on and on and on. I'm really happy that we were able to have this time together and that the internet cooperated, even if the sound was a little wonky and funky in some places, but I hope the quality of the recording allows folks to kind of revisit it.
Terrific. Great job.
All right. Be well. Enjoy the rest of the conference today.
Thank you, Zaretta. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Be well.